Thanks. I just want to remind everyone that these seminars that CUSID is hosting are, of course, pay what you can to donate to the Titani Debate League. It would be awesome to see if people are able to do that. If not, of course, that's understandable. I'm just here to help you guys with some information for anything that you might want help with. So, the title of the seminar, as you may have seen, is IDK IR. I don't know IR. I'm going to be going through when to identify that you have a knowledge gap, how to identify that you have that knowledge gap, how to fill that gap with reasonable claims that are both A, realistic, B, equitable, which is probably the most important one, and C, that you aren't doing things that are going to basically nuke your own case. So the first thing I want to just talk about is when we're looking at international relations itself and the idea of a knowledge gap, right? And after I get into that, I want to go into the basically four different kinds of IR motions. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list. This is some of the different kinds of motions. So there are country-specific motions, large economic coalitions, post-war and post-colonial nationalism, and intervention. So I'll be going through all four of those after this first part, where I'm just going to be going through identifying and using knowledge gaps for yourself. So the first thing I want to make clear is this is not a how to always take the number one in a IR debate without knowing anything about the world. That is not what this is about. This is about how to hold your own. This is about how to make the best case possible that you can, given your limited information. Right? So this is how to ensure that you still speak well, that you still do the absolute best you can, that you still give it your all. Hopefully for you, that means taking the first. It might mean taking the second, the third, or even the four, but just with a lot better speaks than you would have gotten otherwise. So in terms of knowledge gaps, right, I basically think that there's kind of two different ones. Basically one where you know nothing and one where you know like it exists, like you've heard the country's name before. So I actually think that when we're looking at a knowledge gap and when we're identifying a knowledge gap, it's important to identify which one we have, right? Is this one where I really just don't know anything about the area that they're talking about, right? So for example, is this an Israel-Palestine motion and I just don't know anything about the entire area? I just like broadly know that Israel and Palestine exists, I just don't know anything else. Is this a topic about Russian aggression in the Baltic states? I don't know what Baltic means. I know what Russia means, I guess, right? So it's important to distinguish between the second example, which would have been a know-nothing example, and the first one where it's a you know it exists kind of idea, right? Now, the reason that it's important to identify these two is because it's important for when you build off of what you're going to have, right? I almost think that a know-nothing knowledge gap is a little bit better because with a know-it-exists knowledge gap, you have your preconceptions from your very limited amount of information, which can hinder you in making reasonable claims and reasonable deductions with the topic. That's why I kind of advise that when you're getting this an IR topic where you don't know a lot or really anything about it, you might know some little minor details like you know the two countries exist and around where they are on the map. It's better to do with a know-nothing type approach, where you're actually looking at it and saying, okay, if I just don't really know anything, how can I make some reasonable deductions to then build a case and build arguments off of? Essentially, no matter what the motion, even where you do have a good idea of these ideas and everything and what we're actually looking at, it's important that you take a second to step back and do some world building, do some characterization in your prep room before you actually get into it. Okay, so, also I just wanted to add on, because I realized I forgot to say that as the start as well, I'll take questions at the end of the seminar if anybody has any. So, the first type of IR topic I'd like to discuss, right? The country-specific motion. So this is a topic that is usually, like, as it says, about one country individually, and largely about something that should happen domestically for that country, or what they should do internationally. And it's generally not a country that you would expect for the tournament itself. So, for example, a tournament being hosted in the US, you would expect a motion about the US and Canada, you would expect a motion about Canada. If Worlds is in Thailand, you'd expect one about Thailand, that kind of idea. So it's usually one where it's about something that's not normally like relevant to that exact area, but still specific to a different country. Other than being up to date on current events, there's not a whole lot you can do here, right? There's not a whole lot that you can automatically grab without having to go to making reasonable deductions and to creating a strategy from it, right? So I have a couple different topics that were set at either a past Worlds or past European University Debate Championships in the past 2 or 3 years that I'm going to use to discuss this. So the first one is from this past Worlds in Thailand. I'm trying to remember the round off the top of my head. I think it was round 5. I'm not really sure. It's this house believes that the Mexican government should adopt measures that enable one cartel to monopolize the drug market. In brackets, it says these measures can include, but are not limited to, targeting enemy cartels, selective arrests, stopping military deployments controlled by this cartel, and renouncing the headhunt on its current leaders. So that's a lot to take in, right? But essentially it's saying that the Mexican government should ally itself with one cartel. Now, instead of stressing over not knowing who the gangs are, who their leaders are, what political party leads or exists in Mexico, take a second, begin with what you can clearly deduce from the topic, right? From the info slide in the topic itself, we are automatically, like, we know for sure there are multiple cartels, right? Because it's telling us that they want to find one to monopolize the drug market. So we know right off the bat that there's going to be multiple cartels, probably for at least the past few decades, if it's gotten to this big of a crisis. If it's gotten to this big of a crisis, it's gone on for this long, current solutions haven't worked, that means the government hasn't been able to stop it for a long time. Okay? So we know there's been multiple cartels, the government hasn't been able to stop it. The cartels obviously control different areas and territory. That's why there's the idea of doing a deployment to the areas controlled by this cartel. So the different cartels control different areas. You can assume that they probably encroach on each other's areas sometimes. And obviously that they're probably extremely violent if they're going off killing individuals, etc. If the government hasn't been able to stop it for all of these decades and everything, you can probably reasonably deduce as well that there is corruption within the government already, right? I think that these are all fair assumptions that you can make right off the bat without knowing anything other than the words that are actually on the info slide or on the motion. And I think it's important for us that we don't automatically go towards making arguments, but rather figuring out what is the world we live in. What is the actual idea that we're actually going to be focusing on for this, right? So with that known information, how would this policy need to be implemented in order to work? Whether you're on OGOO, CGCO, it doesn't matter. You want to be thinking that exact same thing first off the bat. With that known information, with the idea that there's been multiple cartels for decades, a corrupt government that hasn't been able to stop them, the cartels control territory and sometimes actually act out against each other. You now have to partner with that. You now understand what does the government actually need to do to make this policy work. Because on opposition, it's not enough to just say that there's nothing they can do to make it work, or, oh, they'll do it this way, which won't make it work. You want to figure out what is the reasonable case, what is the reasonable assumption we're operating under that I can either argue for or against, right? So if we're going to be partnering with a cartel to monopolize the market, we're probably going to have to go with the biggest, if not like the second biggest kind of cartel, right? We're going to have to go with a very large or well-trained cartel, right? If we're going to want them to monopolize the drug market, I guess option A for them is they can do it all shooty and kill lots of people and wreak havoc. Or B, the government could probably say that they'll offer amnesty to other cartel members that either join that cartel or renounce their cartel membership, right? We're going to have to accept the fact that the cartel, or the government is going to have to accept the fact that the cartel that they ally themselves with has been and probably will be in the future violent to its opposition. Oh, I'm sorry about that. I received a call. So that we have to accept that they're probably going to be violent to some of their enemies. That's probably going to be a thing that occurs there, right? But now with these ideas and everything, without knowing a single proper noun other than Mexico, we are able to reasonably deduce why this policy would be or would not be beneficial for the area, right? In this debate specifically, right? So we're obviously, this isn't a question of feasibility. This is just what the Mexican government would do. We're saying whether or not it's good or bad. We're now able to actually draw on those arguments from these ideas, right? We have obviously this principal idea that opposition can do about allying yourself with these individuals. Proposition can actually do an idea about how this mitigates the harms of corruption, because the police force is already corrupt and turning a blind eye. Now we're actually just leaning into it and saying like, no, fine, we're going to be corrupt to this one organization only, and actually get a solution to the problem with practical solutions, right? And lots of other arguments there, but really just building off of that kind of idea. Okay? Another good example was a few years ago, a motion, this House believes that Greece should introduce significant financial incentives for companies and individuals currently based in Athens to relocate to other Greek cities. And that there was a info slide that over a third of the Greek population lives in Athens. Now, I've actually seen a topic similar to this as well. I think it was, this House believes that France should introduce significant financial incentives for companies and individuals currently based in Paris to relocate to other French cities. And it's one that you can do with lots of countries that have a one large urban core and then lots of rural and some urban around it, right? It's a motion that does happen with them. Again, if I only know the words Greece and Athens because of this topic, the first thing I need to be doing, other than thinking, how is this going to affect Greek politics? Or I know something. I know that they kind of had that Golden Dawn party, that far-right party. Is this going to make Nazis or something? I'm not sure. Don't take the little amount of known information you have and try to make it into the big example and everything. Because you probably don't know much about it if you don't know lots about the topic in the first place, and it's the only example you can really think of, right? If you're thinking of like Indian feminism, you probably just shouldn't say Gulabi gang because it's the one example you know. You should probably work to make reasonable deductions and to justify your claims rather than resting on a random example that may or may not apply, you don't know. So when you're looking at this one with Greece, Athens, etc., what you really want to be looking at is saying, okay, we clearly have a urban-rural divide. We clearly have other urban cores that would need to be revitalized, and probably rural areas that could be settled as well, right? So you probably are able to see right away that in order for this topic to really work, you would need it to be incentives for people to move both to other major cities or to rural Greece, right? And you now understand that that's actually what we're talking about. Is what would be best for an economy in this idea of how would that economy actually benefit the most? How is all of society going to benefit the most overall from this idea, right? But other than being up to date on current events, there's not much else that you really can do other than make these reasonable deductions. So it's important that in your prep, you take that second to step back, to actually look at the topic, instead of immediately going with the one or two things you kind of know. Take a step back and see the reasonable deductions and claims you're able to make. See what you're able to see, like, or characterize of the policy or the idea in order for it to actually work, right? Take that second where you not only step back to characterize that, but also with that one or two ideas you have in your head, you have of that thing, of the one or two things you do know, you can see if it actually fits with your case or not, right? A lot of times, very experienced debaters, myself included, will use the one random example that we do know from that and talk about it in a debate where it has no context. I can't tell you the amount of different teams. There was in WUDC Netherlands, there was a motion that was in the Netherlands, this House would give every individual 2 votes. Really weird motion anyway. That aside, so many different teams just had an extension about Black Pete, the extremely racist caricature that the Dutch have of a helper of Santa for Dutch Christmas. Now, it doesn't have anything to do with giving 2 votes to every individual in the Netherlands. It has nothing to do with the topic. Everybody knew that one example, though, so they just threw that in there to show that they kind of know something. It's so much better to just not do that, right? Like it's so much better to just actually make reasonable deductions and reasonable claims about things that actually have to do with that topic matter, rather than rest on other weird examples that ultimately just waste your time that you could be spending actually developing your claims that you have, right? So let's look at another type of IR motion, of international relation motion, right? Now, this one is, I basically broadly call large economic coalitions, right? So these can be debates that are about, like it says, large economic coalitions, right? Like, so we're looking at the European Union, the African Union, ASEAN, a host of different international organizations, right? When we're looking at all of these different ideas. I'm sorry, not all these different ideas. All these different institutions that actually bring these countries together to make different agreements, right? So again, I have a couple of different examples for this. One from the previous worlds, where it's this House believes that ASEAN, ASEAN, for those who don't know, should abandon the ASEAN way, right? And that's, of course, the Association of Southeastern Asian Nations. Now, the ASEAN way is essentially, I can't remember the exact term, but basically there was an info slide for it, saying that essentially the ASEAN way is that ASEAN respects the sovereignty and the principle of non-interference of all of its individual members. So essentially that no ASEAN decision will overrule a country's domestic decision. Right? And the topic is, this House believes that ASEAN should abandon the ASEAN way. Now, in this one, they were actually really lucky, because I believe the info slide did include a list of the different countries that are in ASEAN, so that would be very helpful. But we can even look at it without looking at that idea, right? Without actually knowing the exact proper nouns of all of these different countries. The first thing that we usually want to look at with large economic coalitions that applies in most different cases is centralization versus decentralization, right? So are we talking about so is the topic basically taking us from a decentralized state of affairs to a centralized one, or vice versa? So with this idea, of course, we're seeing if we're abandoning the ASEAN way, we're abandoning the principle that each of their sovereignty should be accepted, and their oh my god and there should be non-interference, etc. Then we understand, okay, like, we're abandoning that idea, we're obviously going towards centralization. So When you recognize if it's centralization versus decentralization, I think that's a really good stepping ground for most individuals when they don't know anything about that topic, right? Because there are broad concepts of why centralization or decentralization are both good and bad that you can draw on from other ideas, right? And again, making those kinds of deductions, right? Seeing how can centralization benefit? They're currently in decentralization. Are there any problems you know of in that area? If you don't, that's okay. Don't rest your laurels on those problems that you kind of know about. Instead, come up to reasonable deductions as to what issues they may be facing right now due to decentralization, right? Is it harder to trade between nations than it would be if they abandoned the ASEAN way, right? That's probably a very low-hanging fruit that's available there, but the one that you can think of right away, right? And then going from there, is that inability to trade a good or bad thing, right? Would we see domination of one of the ASEAN states over the rest? If they had complete and open economic barriers, what would we what would we be able to see? And making our claims off of these ideas, rather than immediately seeing it and saying like, I don't really know what ASEAN is, going into that of centralization versus decentralization. Now, specifically though, with these kinds of large economic coalitions, and especially on topics about the EU and the Euro, we have this idea of import versus export economies, right? So import versus export economies is like incredibly simple that even like dum-dums like me can kind of understand, right? It's just that, are you an economy that imports more than you export? Okay, you're an import economy. Do you export more than you import? Okay, you are an export economy. So export economies want the rest of the world to be able to buy what they are manufacturing and what they're trying to sell. Because of that, they want their own currency to be valued relatively lower so that other countries are able to buy more of their product because the other country has a currency advantage. Right? So essentially just if a country is exporting and wants you to buy their goods, you will generally want your currency to be on the lower end so that individuals are incentivized to buy from your nation. Conversely, if you are an import nation and you're looking to buy the goods from different countries, you want a very high value currency so that you are able to buy more of different countries' goods and services with less money. Now, in almost every large economic coalition, you have import economies and export economies coexisting. When we look at the euro, for example, I think we see a very high trend of these import and export economies coexisting within it, leading to a lot of different harms within the EU and the euro, right? So when we're looking at this difference between import and export economies, we can see that we look at nations like Spain, like Italy, like Portugal, like Greece, which largely were import economies, versus a country like Germany, which was an export economy, right? Getting everybody to buy their cars and automobiles and drive around in their little German cars. So Germany has wanted the euro to be lower than it could be, because they want individuals from other countries, from buying with other currencies, to be able to buy more of their goods. Different nations like Greece, Italy, Spain, which you may have noticed have all been going through different economic disasters prior to the current state of affairs, all want their currency to be as high as it possibly can be so that they can buy more goods with less of the money. This is where the idea of actually having these large kinds of decisions and everything comes into place. But the same idea could be applied to ASEAN, right? Now, in ASEAN, without even knowing the proper nouns and everything, you can reasonably deduce that there will be some import and some export economies within ASEAN. You can reasonably deduce that abandoning the ASEAN way, if you're on proposition, is a good thing because now you're able to unify these import and export economies into one that's more stable, into one that isn't as volatile as a just import or just export economy, where it's volatile because it can suffer any kind of crash on a global scale, where they no longer import or export to. Or could it be very bad, where you end up seeing that one nation that's either an import or an export keeps it artificially high or low in order to gain benefits, right? In this case, they actually did give a list of ASEAN nations. You look at that list, you see Singapore is pretty obviously an import economy. They're probably going to want the dollar to actually be a lot lower than it actually could be. This can, higher than it. They're going to want it to be as high as possible. Meanwhile, because they're an import economy, meanwhile, you'll have nations in the rest of ASEAN which are trying to export, which have lots of manufacturing, which now are having a tougher time to do it because ASEAN has abandoned the ASEAN way, right? And I think this comes up again. There's another topic on this idea. In circumstances where a unanimous decision is currently required, this House prefers majority voting as the European Council's decision-making approach. So in circumstances where a unanimous decision is currently required, this House prefers majority voting as the European Council's decision-making approach. If you come into this topic without knowing what the European Council is, that is okay. Right? You can probably deduce from this idea. I'm not sure if this motion actually had an info slide or not, but again, going at it without the proper nouns. If you're looking at it just saying the European Council, majority voting, you can reasonably deduce that it has something to do with the European Union, that it's probably where, if it's the European Council and it's the council, you know, like other like international organizations have councils, it's probably one representative from each nation that's on it. Okay, so whatever their unanimous decisions that they have to currently do, I'm not exactly sure because I'm not exactly sure what the European Council is in charge of to begin with. Now they need a simple majority. Understanding that right off the bat is very important to it. But then being able to couple that analysis with this idea of centralization and decentralization. Right? An idea where we essentially where we're looking at the European Council having a more unified vision versus a more divided vision where things may not get done as well in different countries. When we look at it in the context of import versus export economies, will this give a simple majority to whichever economy is more dominant within it to allow them to take over? Is that a bad idea? Is that why we need unanimous decision making? Right? So again, I think that that centralization, decentralization, import versus export economies, they're good stepping stones that you can use on these ideas of large economic coalitions. This is by no means saying that like these are the best arguments you will be able to access in all of them. But again, a lot of those come with having a special knowledge in that area, right? Having kept up on some current events, doing those kinds of things. Okay, so with that idea out of the way, so we covered this idea of country-specific motions. We've covered this idea of large economic coalitions. I now want to get into this idea of post-war and post-colonial nationalism. Now, this is these are topics where essentially you are looking at a country or area of the world that it has gone through war or recently colonialism that is attempting essentially to comment on the state of affairs or prescribe a policy to that area of what they should do or what they should have done differently in creating that nation, essentially. So I have a couple different, so obviously like that definition might have been kind of broad, you might not like actually understand what I'm talking about. So I have a couple of example topics. So number one, this House regrets the glorification of the immediate post-colonial leaders in sub-Saharan Africa. Number two, this House believes that South Korea should abandon the goal of and all policies which aim at Korean reunification. Right? So this House regrets the glorification of the immediate post-colonial leaders in sub-Saharan Africa. this house regrets the glorification, and then this house believes that South Korea should abandon the goal of, and all policies which aim at, Korean reunification. So again, with both of these topics, without really knowing the proper nouns, it's more important than to know the a couple of obscure facts that you know about a sub-Saharan African country or post-colonial leader, or the random facts you know about South or North Korea, right? It's a lot more important to actually look at this and say, okay, what are we actually talking about? What's the actual state of affairs here? So with these kinds of topics, I find that there's two things that are very important to look at. The first one is an idea of constructing identity, right? When we're talking about post-war or post-colonial nationalism or post-war, post-colonial areas, we have to look at how identity has been constructed, right? Often we're looking at colonial structures assigning and constructing identity versus a mix of traditional identity structures and forms of labeling identity, right? Now, it's important to look at the ends as well, post-colonial labels of identity, of course, as well. So the reason why that's a very important thing is, without actually being able to really know what we're talking about when we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa, if you don't actually know what countries you're specifically talking about, it's more important to look at that idea that identity is obviously constructed in different ways, right? It's obviously very important to look at that idea that it's not just identity being pushed down by the oppressive colonial regime, but there is still a natural identity that always existed and would continue to exist even with colonial regimes, right? Now, the second thing that's very important to look at with these topics, and this really expands on the first thing a lot more, is the idea that within any of your actors, that no actor is a monolith, right? And I think that this is where a lot of inequitable arguments come up, and a lot of inequitable arguments are constructed by individuals, where the person isn't trying to be inequitable, but they also aren't actively trying to not be, right? They also aren't actively trying to be equitable when they're dealing with these ideas. So I think it's actually very important to actively try to be equitable rather than just not try to be inequitable when you're actually constructing these kinds of arguments, right? Because obviously these are, when we're talking about war-torn areas, when we're talking about areas where they suffered, where individuals suffered horrors of colonialism, whether it's at home in Canada or abroad, we obviously need to err on the side of caution when we, specifically in this context of we don't know anything about the area, right? So when we're looking at this idea of constructing identity, when we're looking at this idea of multiple actors, where we're actually looking at state and non-state actors, it's always important to look at sub-actors, right? Because we aren't just looking at a monolith. No group is just acting in one way all by themselves, right? If we're looking at, and this, I guess you would need to actually know some proper nouns, but if we're looking at the Rwandan genocide and the Hutus and the Tutsis, it wasn't that every single Hutu was killing every single Tutsi, right? We saw Hutus kill other Hutus. We saw Tutsis being killed by Tutsis as well. We see that no actual group is a monolith. There's lots of things that happen on the majority. There's lots of terrible atrocities that happen there, but we don't want to act automatically just with an info slide that says the Hutus killed the Tutsis, automatically say that every single Hutu is responsible for this because every single Hutu was involved in this. That's obviously an inequitable thing to say if you know about the situation. And if you don't know about the situation, you should try to actively avoid being inequitable and actively be equitable with it. The way to do that is to construct it with state and non-state sub-actors, to actually look at people individually rather than just as a group in a monolith itself. The second reason why it's important to do that is because your arguments are actually a lot better. But I do think that that's a less important reason in this case. The reason why it makes the argument better, however, is because you actually get to balance two different things when you're actually looking at impacting. Right? Because I think a lot of people forget to weigh impact when they're doing impacting. They usually just say, what are the benefits of my side? What are the harms of their side? The other important thing to look at, of course, is likelihood, right? So when we're looking at likelihood, it's important to weigh how likely is their side of the house's like characterization to happen, how likely is our side's to happen. When you actually look at the like sub-actors themselves, it helps you weigh on likelihood because you're able to see what kinds of tensions might exist depending on the ideas of identity we're talking about, right? So if we're talking about, for example, the glorification of the immediate post-colonial leaders in sub-Saharan Africa, and I don't know names like Mugabe, I don't know like these kinds of ideas, right? I think that it's important that you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, if we're looking at constructing identity, if we're specifically looking at what kind of identity is being constructed or what time frame this is happening, right? We obviously know that, okay, we're talking about post-colonial sub-Saharan Africa, so they definitely had colonial identities put onto them, right? Even without knowing that sub-Saharan Africa includes South Africa, and even if not knowing that South Africa had the apartheid regime all the way up until the 90s, you still are able to reckon that colonialism was doing bad things to those individuals, and one of which was on a society level of actually creating social classes and stratifying them, right? So we obviously are looking at this and saying like, okay, so the glorification of the immediate post-colonial leaders in sub-Saharan Africa, why would we reasonably think that that would be done? It would probably be done as a rejection or pushback against colonial narratives that were just present until the post-colonial era, right? So we're probably talking about narratives and everything that glorify the individuals who are immediately in these leadership roles because they are the most immediate and present example of this. If we're on proposition and we're thinking, because obviously this is a regrets motion, so we're thinking, well, what ideas would have been used instead? Rather than immediately going to the one or two minute examples you have and creating a argument that even though you didn't intend it to be ends up being inequitable based off of those ideas that you had, and that's how you assume everybody works and functions, rather than doing that kind of thing, you actually go through it, look at it, and you say like, okay, so this glorification of immediate post-colonial leaders, what would we do instead of that? Well, if we're looking at it on a societal level, we'd probably look at glorifying more the leaders that were there before and during colonialism, right? And actually glorifying people who resisted against the structures and people who existed before the colonial regimes actually took their places. With that, whether you're on proposition or opposition, with knowing what the idea that you're actually talking about is, it's a lot easier to go in and figure out who are the main actors and sub-actors within this debate. What might their motivations and intentions be, right? Are we talking about individuals who wanted to, for example, solidify their leadership and solidify their legacies? Are we also talking about people who wanted to escape colonial narratives that were oppressing their societies and their cultures? Were people looking at this as the best way to actually like punch up and fight back with this? Can solace, can catharsis, can actual like inspiration be drawn on from individuals in the past who came before these colonial structures, or even people who ultimately, while losing their battle, won the overall war of getting freedom from colonialism? In the same way, this idea that this House believes that South Korea should abandon the goal of and all policies which aim at Korean reunification. If I walk into this motion and I'm not entirely sure where on the map the two Koreas are, like I would assume from this that there's a second Korea, probably North Korea, and I'm not entirely sure why the two actually have their fight. Now, I can't actually imagine this being like something that someone in debate is completely ignorant about. I would assume people generally know that North Korea is a dictatorship, as that's like fairly common knowledge, and that South Korea is different than North Korea. I generally assume that people know that idea. What you can look at from this, though, is saying that, okay, South Korea and reunifying with North Korea is probably something that's been going on for a long time. It's probably something that hasn't actually been working out, right? It's probably something that's very bad for this, that's being very bad for them if this is being suggested as a topic, right? So if we're looking at actually trying to attain the goal of and the policies which aim at Korean reunification, we can deduce that there probably are a significant amount, that they probably actually cost a lot of money, and that their efforts have probably been fruitless if we haven't actually seen any measures and we actually haven't seen them being unified yet, right? So based off of that, both opposition and proposition can build their arguments based off of that limited amount of known information, right? On opposition, you get to look at ideas of constructing identity and saying how you actually want to reinforce the narrative that Koreans are Koreans, that they are one and the same, that they shouldn't have to look at random political divides and borders in order to actually other each other and become different. You can actually look at that idea of constructing identity and saying how it actually would be good for South Korea to continue those goals, even if they aren't achievable, because it gives individuals this passion to reunite, to rescue their brethren, to bring them into the fold and reunite, right? And on proposition, you're able to actually look at it and say that it's not allowing you to look at practical solutions, that rather than looking at reunification, perhaps we should be looking at just defense from it, or B, actually, rather than just looking at reunification itself, deposing a leader, right? We can actually look at these kinds of ideas and make prioritization arguments off that. Okay, so the last type of topic I would like to bring up, and for this one, while for the other three topic ideas, I had 2 topics each. This one I actually don't have any example topics for, because this is the most common version of international relations topics, I think. And when I say the idea, I think that most people will have a topic that will pop in their own head. Intervention, right? Where essentially we're talking about a state actor going into an area, doing an intervention, right? Maybe it's this believes that the U.S. should invade Syria. Maybe it's something about Afghanistan. Maybe it's right. There's a bunch. So what you need to actually do with these kinds of topics, first off, is this is again an idea where generalizations are not your friend. Right? We're assuming actors act as monoliths and that groups act as like big groups and not as individuals is probably a bad idea. What you want to be looking at here is probably these ideas of I think there's basically like 3 main ideas that you want to be looking at. The first one that you're looking at is ideas behind international law. So the reason I hesitate so much and kind of giggle with it is, of course, because international law is a very subjective and applied loosely thing. It isn't applied in every single situation like it should be. International law is a human construct that's very recent. I'm seeing a question. Have there been questions this whole time? I don't know. In an intervention round, is it okay if as op you analyze why the state doing the intervention may not be great at doing the intervention? Well, yes, of course. I think that that's a thing that you can talk about of failures of that intervention that would occur if that country were to do it. As an opposition team, right? If proposition is saying we should intervene, then yeah, opposition is very allowed to say if the practical outcomes are negative, then we should not intervene. Right? Obviously, if it's worded differently, for example, like the Thessaloniki Worlds Finals, where it was this house believes that the world poor would be justified in seeking Marxist revolution, then that changes it, obviously, right? Then opposition can't just say, oh, well, it won't work. They have to say why they aren't justified in doing it. So when you're looking at these ideas of international law and everything, I think that too often people use vague ideas of international law to justify their own arguments. I generally say to tend against this, right? To not really look at this all in and of itself. I think what a better idea to do is is to actually look in and say, like, okay, how can like this intervention actually be successful, right? How can it actually work out for the key actors in the area, right? Usually with intervention motions that we're looking at today, they are state and non-state actors involved. But I briefly want to touch on state and state actors, right? Where we're talking about like two like neighboring states, like actively like building up and warring, etc. So first off, I think there's this idea, it's called democratic peace theory, where essentially two true democracies never go to war with each other because both democracy requires all of the people's consent to go to war with that people's, and usually it's easy to get people in a democracy to hate a regime, but harder to get them to hate the people. I don't know how much I buy that. I think that it's a very weak impact to rest on that says like, oh, well, by invading and we establish a democracy, it'll be great because of democratic peace theory. I think it's a lot more important to start to explain why that they will like want democracy, why that's even a good system for them in the first place, or why it might be accepted, right? Now, when we're looking at state and state actors, the idea of the international relations like concept of realism is one that's a interesting one to look at, or important one to look at, right? If we're looking at, for example, a Japan rearming themselves motion, or one such as that, or I think this was at a Worlds a few years ago, of South Korea developing nuclear weapons, realism is a theory that can come into play very simply. So realism is the international relations theory that essentially state actors want to be as militarily powerful and mightful as possible in order to use their hard power to, which is basically like their military might, to dissuade attacks from occurring in the first place. That's basically what's important for here, right? So it's a good theory to be able to draw on, going at it and looking at like to justify those kinds of explanations and examples, etc. But again, I think it's more important to actually look at practical benefits or practical implications in these ideas more than vague theoretical concepts. So when we're looking at practical benefits, right, I think that we can look at ideas like bringing stability to a war-torn area, right? Bringing greater or like less human rights abuses to individuals, right? Like less tortures, less unjustified killings, etc. Material aid, material benefits to individuals, food, water, clothing, money, hospitals, schools, etc., right? And I think the last one is rectifying injustice, right? Whether that's reconciliation, whether that's revenge, depending on like what the motion is, basically. I think that these are all these different kind of practical benefits that's better to look at instead of the theoretical concepts behind them. Now, if you're on Gov and you're having to argue for the practicality of the intervention and you don't know lots about the area and you don't know like about that, well, like etc., I think that it's good to basically like first off like accept that, okay, crud, you don't know a lot, but B, look at it reasonably and say, in order for this intervention to be successful, what would have to happen? What would have to be true, right? Like what would we have to do in order to actually make a successful intervention there? Whether that means committing lots of troops, whether that means building a broad foreign coalition, right? Like all these different ideas in order to actually make that work. Okay. Now, I talked a little bit about state and state actors and how that doesn't come up as much. I think one that does a lot is, of course, terrorism, right? And this idea behind terrorism. So qualifying factors behind terrorism are usually non-unique to most counterinsurgencies, right? Like broadly defined, terrorism is the use of violence by a non-state actor to achieve a socio-political objective. That captures every rebellion effort, basically, and lots of protests. I think that it's important as debaters and when we are like actually building our arguments off of these kinds of grounds, to reject that framing because it doesn't make sense on a practical level, and it doesn't actually aid in building arguments on a practical level. What makes most sense in this idea instead is to actually look at the practical benefits that are trying to be applied, right? When we're actually looking at why are these individuals like creating these campaigns of terror? Is it simply because of unjustified occupation, right? Is it because of power struggles between one group and another group? Is it because one group has literally just been silenced by the other group, and this is their only way to actually have any form of political expression? What's important when you're doing this, though, is rather than just randomly assign one of these to the group you're talking about, because you don't know a lot about them, what's important is to talk about all of these different ideas, right? And argue about all these different scenarios and talking about how no matter what the case, it applies to your side. Not only is that actively being actively ensuring that your arguments are trying to be equitable and aren't painting individuals as monoliths with their groups, but on top of that, you're actually making sure that you are covering a broad base of characterizations that can come up from the other teams in the debate. You cover a lot more. You make way less inequitable arguments, and you hopefully make very equitable ones that are actually trying to be them. But on top of that, you're actually making sure that you're centering your case off of what's reasonably deduced from these ideas and off of practical benefits or practical detriments that can come to these areas. So that is everything I have for the lecture. I thank you very much for hosting me, everybody. I said near the beginning that I take questions at the end. I'm not entirely sure how that works, but if anybody has them, I'm welcome to them. Not all at once. I can't hear you all if you all speak at the same time. That was a joke, of course. Okay, if there aren't any questions, though, unless there are, no? Sophie?
Yeah, oh, wait, no, there's a question just now.
Oh.
All right, I'll let you answer that.
Okay. Who has the question, sorry?
It's in the chat. I can read it out loud to you.
Oh, there we go. In the glorification motion, yes. In the glorification motion, so referencing this House regrets the glorification of the immediate post-colonial leaders in sub-Saharan Africa. Could you further differentiate between characteristics of immediate leaders and the ones who came before the regime? And give an example for a model of successful intervention. Oh boy, okay. So for the first question, in the glorification motion, could you further differentiate between characteristics of immediate leaders and the ones who came before the regime? Yes, of course. So I would say that if you're looking at this, you want to be looking at the idea that not just the characteristics of these leaders, but the idea of the glorification of specific leaders itself, right? So opposition kind of has to defend this idea of specifically glorifying the immediate post-colonial leaders in sub-Saharan Africa. Proposition gets to build a world where the glorification was possibly of the people who were before immediately before the post-colonial leaders or way before the post-colonial leaders, or even that we glorify the post-colonial leaders who are more modern day as well as these actors too. So you can definitely differentiate between the characteristics of them a bit, but again, if you don't know lots about the proper nouns that you're actually talking about, I'd be hesitant to do that too much and get into generalizations of here's what a post-colonial leader looks like and here's what a colonial leader looks like, because again, generally very different across different nations. On the question of could you give an example of a model for a successful intervention? I can give you the example of a debate model. So first off, the UN probably shouldn't be involved. A lot of people, when they're first starting out especially, like to just kind of say, like, this house would be the UN, we would do this kind of thing. The UN is generally an actor with no teeth, right? That it can't actually get lots of these things done. Generally, you would say that the house would be of course, this vastly depends on the motion, but I guess you would probably say there would be an international coalition of countries that are like for those interests. So, for example, it may be NATO countries, or it may be BRIC countries. So, or like it might be like Russia do it. Actually, no, I guess North America we don't really debate from that side too much. But it might be like Russia, like it might be Russia, etc. So, when you're looking at that, the next thing that you want to make sure of is that your debate model for this intervention isn't like trying to bite off more than you can chew. Too many times you're saying like people are just like, okay, I'm going to have this like we're going to go in and we're going to change the regime and we're going to impose democracy, and it's like, okay, well, who will take over for the dictator? It's like the opposition. Okay, well, which opposition? There's tons of different oppositions, right? So I think what's really important when you're looking at that is see specifically what's actually trying to be achieved by this topic. What do I need to do to achieve that? Not what are we looking at, like what does an intervention look like from the past, right? So for example, if you're looking at like materially benefiting the area, perhaps you're sending in soldiers and officers to train militias to do your fighting, right? Because they know the area a lot better than your own soldiers would know the area. They have the language skills, and they themselves want to create a stable political environment for them, right? So is it something like in the real world, like where Canada sends their own military to go to Kurdistan and help train the Peshmerga, right? So like that is a great example. I think that generally saying that you're going to have like thousands, like hundreds of thousands of troops go in, like total warfare, is really a bad policy because it's very hard to win on that idea. Okay. I don't see any other questions. I think that's everything. I think that's everyone.
Okay, thank you so much for giving the seminar. I learned a lot personally, especially as someone who doesn't really think of IR as their strength. Just a reminder to everyone, if you could please donate, the link is up there. It's bit.do/theleaguedonate. And again, thank you so much to Alexander for making the time to give the seminar. This will be uploaded to the QSID YouTube promptly. All right, thank you so much, everyone. I will see y'all at the practice at 7:30 if you're showing up.
Have fun, everybody. Thanks for letting me impart this on y'all.
Anytime. All right, goodbye.